Welcome to the Job Shop Show, where we talk with the owners, suppliers, partners, and customers of custom manufacturers. Listen and learn the secrets of top-performing job shops, the tools, techniques, and backgrounds that have made them successful, all in the quest of raising the bar for custom manufacturing. I'm your host, Jay Jacobs. This episode is sponsored by Paperless Parts, connecting buyers and suppliers of custom manufactured parts. The Paperless platform is a secure, ITAR-compliant, cloud-based manufacturing system for suppliers that reduces the amount of time spent on sales, estimating, quoting, administration, and order processing. It offers seamless integration with the accounting and ERP software tools that shops already use, such as QuickBooks, E2, and JobBoss. Paperless Parts was founded with a mission to make manufacturing more accessible by streamlining the quote-to-cash process. Spend less time quoting and more time selling. Shazam! Welcome to the Job Shop Show. In this episode, joining us is the Cody Lee, the improbable owner of Everyday Technologies. I say improbable because Everyday started way back in 1928, and Cody is not a generational owner. He purchased the company in 2021 at the age of 29, and as a 100% owner with his wife, no other shareholders. This takes a lot of intention, which is evident throughout our conversation. Cody made the conscious decision to become a business owner, and we get into the meat of his looking at potential businesses to buy and then ultimately purchasing Everyday Technologies. Then, a long discussion on what to do after buying a shop. Now it's yours. Cody found that the role you play in the beginning may not be the one you really want to be doing. And we talk about how to be intentional and change that. Sales and marketing, nitty gritty. This is a conversation with an owner in the middle of navigating everything every day and being open and willing to share. Here we go. Cody, welcome to the Job Shop Show.
Appreciate you having me, Jay. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am too. And as I was doing my research, one of the things that popped out on your website, tucked in at the bottom, is every day is ready to work with you in truth, love, and unity. Now that's unusual on a manufacturing website. Tell me about it.
Well, full transparency, that's a remnant of previous ownership, actually. They had a pretty strong faith that carried into the business itself. And it was, really sprinkled around a lot more things than just the bottom of the website there. Everything from their mission, vision, values to different ways that they ran and operated the business. But full transparency, that's just a remnant of something they had included there a few years back.
Well, it looks like you've honored it, and sounds like the values are pretty much embedded in the company, so it's something worth carrying on.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to ask, because we're recording this just after the new year has started, I want to get into how 2024 ended up for you. Let's, though, give someone who's listening a brief overview of Everyday Technologies and Cody Lee.
Sure. Yeah, so Everyday Technologies have been around for almost 100 years. So they got their start back in 1928. Obviously, I was not the original founder of the business, but it had been located here in our hometown of Sydney, Ohio, which is about 30 minutes north of Dayton, Ohio. Really got its start as probably a small mom and pop job shop that really catered to really just making a variety of different products for the chicken coop business. And so that meant everything from like chicken feeders to cages, a lot of different items that were produced out of galvanized metal. Back in the 20s and the 30s, it was obviously pretty relevant to have coops in your backyard as a way of living. And so they serviced that market for many, many years. I'm not really exactly sure, probably in the 60s, it kind of transitioned from servicing that type of market to becoming a more traditional job shop. I think back in the 60s and the 70s and definitely the 80s, there was a big manufacturing boom here in our hometown and really more so in our county, Shelby County, Ohio. We've got, some pretty predominant players that have been around for a while, folks like Airstream, Emerson, or Copeland. Honda has a big presence here. They've got several plants in the area. And there was a lot of, second and third tier manufacturers that had popped up over the decades to support those different industries. And so, Everyday kind of jumped on that bandwagon probably in the 60s and 70s. And from there, really just kind of played the job shop role for many years until about 1999, whenever the owners previous to myself had purchased the business. And from there, they spent the next, 20 years or so kind of transitioning from job shop manufacturing to what we would call contract manufacturing. So working with a lot more established OEMs kind of around the United States, not just in our backyard, and really kind of defining what the processes are to be able to onboard and do work for OEMs like that. So that's a little bit of the background on Everyday. Our core capabilities are really traditional fabrication in the sense that we order sheet material, we cut on the laser, bend on a press brake, weld both MIG and TIG. We do powder coat in-house as well on both an automated line and a batch manual line. We do some assembly in-house and then warehouse and ship. That's prominently done out of our Sydney, Ohio headquarters facility. And then we've got another location. It's about 25 minutes north of here in Walpock, Ohio. It's another 40,000 square foot building where we do a lot more higher volume type of work. So, we've got several stamping presses, both coiled and hand fed. It's actually where both of our turret punch presses exist. And then we've got a handful of press brakes and spot welders where a lot of that product's being assembled at that facility and then sent down to city to be powder coated on one of our lines. So it's kind of the gist of the Everyday Technologies business. I will say that we do have a sister company that's kind of a spinoff that we executed a couple years ago. But the long story short on that is probably about 9 years ago, the previous owners acquired a small wire harness shop. And probably 2.5 years ago, I brought my brother-in-law in on the business and we spun that off into its own entity. And it exists now operating under the name Everyday Wire Technologies. And that business is about 5 minutes down the road from our fabrication shop. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Everyday Technologies is. Myself, so I'm 32 years old, about to be 33. Acquired the business when I was 29. I'm 100% owner of the fabrication business and co-owner on the wire side. And really, we could certainly get into more details if you like, but again, the long story short was really interested in purchasing a business, really wanted to be in manufacturing, but didn't really have an intention on what type of manufacturing, whether it be plastics or sheet metal, whatever it may be, but came across the opportunity with Everyday Manufacturing. The owners previous to me were opportunistic about the idea and we put a letter of intent in place, and there was a lot that happened between that and closing, but we closed in August of 21.
Certainly want to get into all that because you are relatively young for somebody acquiring a shop, and I'm sure that there's a lot of folks your age who would love to do the same thing. Let me step back a little bit. Roughly, how many folks do you have on the team? How many square feet or how many shifts? That
Right.
sort of thing.
So total head count on the fabrication side is around 60. On the wire side, it's probably around 15 to 18 folks. Square footage wise on the fabrication side, we're probably around 120,000 square feet between the two buildings. Primarily we're running on one shift with a goal to get that into a second shift in the fabrication side here in 2025. And then on the wire harness side, we're probably closer to 20,000 square feet.
Job shop versus contract manufacturer. You use both of those phrases to describe the business. I want to have you really, though, nail a definition because it sounds like you differentiate distinctly between the two.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've got the definition that was sort of given to me coming into the business, and then I've kind of got my own version of it as I've entertained the job shop type of work as a new revenue stream for us at Everyday. But I guess what I would say or define job shop work is more of your project-based type of work. So, that could be with, some company down the road or a large OEM, but basically you're looking at a relatively quick turn. You may or may never see this work again type of jobs. In contrast, you've got contract manufacturing. So, you're typically working with an OEM who's in some cases has a contract they've put together with you with a list of part numbers that you service for them. And there's material pricing in the contract that's driven by a CRU, some sort of index. And it's really just repeat work is what it comes down to. So you put a lot of time up front in terms of engineering and the programming side to be able to run that part for 7+ years.
Gotcha. Do you do any assembly?
Yeah, we do. I would define it as light assembly, but yeah, we've got an assembly team in-house of about 2 or 3 people that's doing a variety of different things, putting on hinges, assembling panels, different things like that.
Are you thinking of going upstream at all, or satisfied where you are?
I would really say the opportunities that come in the future would probably define what that looks like. There's no strategic plan in place to increase that capability today as it sees fit, but not to say we won't go there.
You mentioned too that you have 2 locations as well, and the high volume production. And I always looked at, I'll say this, the shorter run versus the high volume as oil and water, and the mentality of the people who are good at each of those makes them struggle with the other. And
Right.
so we had our production in a separate facility than the prototype. Was that deliberate? I assume that was probably the previous owners, or how did that develop? What was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, so it's actually probably not as deliberate as it may sound, because on paper it sounds like a great idea to split those 2 for the reasons you just said, because there's unique challenges to each one. But really the evolution of how that came to be was probably about 20 years ago, shortly after they acquired the business. We had a long-standing customer that we continue to do business with today, but basically they were looking to get out of vertically integrating their manufacturing process and do just more assembly in-house. And because of the existing relationship with Everyday, had reached out to them about acquiring one of their buildings and basically manufacturing processes that included the stamping and some other operations. And so the gentleman before me had acquired that building and that part of the business and just kind of bolted it on to, what we have here in city is fabrication. So by default, the high volume goes up there because that's the equipment and the parts that we produce. So, but when I say high volume, I've learned that high volume, is a lot of different things, especially in stamping. So we're not doing 1 million EAU parts or even hundreds and hundreds of thousands of a particular part. Our sweet spot's anywhere from, 5,000 pieces up to at most maybe 80,000 pieces on the high end. But probably definitely more skewed towards the middle of that. So it's kind of just happened through evolution of the business.
We wrapped up 2024. How'd the year go for you guys? What were the highs and lows?
Yeah. Well, certainly a lot of both. Oh, it's interesting because I've been out with the business for 3 years, and every year it feels like I'm drinking from a fire hose. So I've not really got to settle down, it feels like, to have some context for what a normal average year looks like compared to one that's just busy, 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 because all 3 of them have been busy for one reason or another. But to kind of boil it down, 2024, it was great in the sense that the previous 2 years, we had put a lot of investment into the business, whether that meant equipment, people changes, ERP systems, different things like that to kind of set the business up for growth. And last year, outside of a couple minor different things that we took on, it was really just like, let's go and start taking advantage of this. And that really started to take shape in Q1 and Q2 of last year. But after about that, so Q3, Q4, we really started to feel the impact of the economy and what was taking place kind of on a macro level. And so at least in my professional career, being a young guy, that was really the first time that, I've really kind of see the headlines in the news really affect my business and my profession. And it sucked. And we had a lot of large customers of ours that were pushing orders out or canceling orders and just kind of reacting to what their demand was at. And with it being election year, kind of heard all the different buzzwords about, holding off to make this decision and their end customers doing the same and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, what that meant was less orders. So we had to really get creative to keep our people busy, because what we didn't want to have to do is a mass layoff, because what we kept hearing was that the expectation was come Q1 of 2025 that things are going to pick back up quite a bit, and you can't be in a spot that you can't perform on that. So that kind of led us to go down some different avenues for opportunities that we typically wouldn't do. Part of that's going after what I would call job shop type work, and of course that presents its challenges to a team that's not really used to that. So but out of that came a lot of growth and a lot of reflection on, what we want to do and problems that we need to solve going into 25. So it was a blessing in disguise, I think, just because it's positioned us to be in a good spot to take advantage of some things as we enter the new year.
Let's expand on that because that sounds exciting. What were you forced to do that you said, we like this and we want to either keep doing it or adapt to a
Right.
different flavor of it?
Yeah. So one of the great things about everyday technologies, and this is really all the credit goes to the previous ownership and a lot of the team that's still here that implemented this, but one of the key differences between, at least from our perspective of the job shop and contract manufacturing type work, is really the amount of effort that is put up front. So for example, if you get a customer, a contract customer that sends you a package of parts or a single part, in this case, let's use a part, and, it's a weldment of, it's not very complex, but it goes through all the different operations. We take that information that we get from the customer. Of course, this is after we've been awarded it. And we've got a small group of folks in here that we call our APQP team, which is, basically goes through all the planning and reviews the part in its entirety to understand all the different risks that might be associated for manufacturing. And really their responsibility is to make sure that when that part enters into production, that it's got a plan in place to be successful for a long period of time. And you're really kind of stripping it down and making the part very easily repeatable out on the floor so that, people aren't spending time out on the floor asking questions and chasing things down. They just run the part. But that takes a hell of a lot of effort up front from programming and engineering to define all that stuff and get that work done. But it's work that is definitely worth it when you consider that part's going to run for years and years and years. Whenever you take a business that its core way of doing business is that process as it introduces new work to the plant, and then you throw a bunch of stuff where it's like, hey, you may never see this part again. The customer wants it in 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. You start to break all that down and deviate from it, and things start to get difficult very quick. And so that's what we've had to deal with the last few months, is kind of chewing through that work that, the folks out on the floor are like, hey, this particular subcomponent doesn't have a print, or there's not a program in place, or whatever the case may be. Things that they're accustomed to seeing don't exist. And us on the sales side, which is where I tend to live more, is just like, hey, we were just trying to get work through the plan as quick as possible, like trying to keep people going. And, but you really start to understand how important that is and where it fits and where it doesn't. So what we're really focused on right now is trying to understand how we can adapt our processes and add to it so that we can kind of eat both of those types of work and be successful at it.
It reminds me of, we face the same challenge at Rapid. And what we realized, our forte was 1, 5, 10 parts really fast. What we realized over time, though, because we would see the same parts again, maybe 6 months, 8 months later, but it was only 10 parts. And we realized we were a production supplier to really low volume manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where our production business came out of. And the way that we had to do business on the prototype side, the one and done, you never see it again, is if you sent the part in again, it just blew up our systems to try to find all the files and do it the same way we did last time. And we gave up on that pretty quickly, and we just totally re-engineered the part. It just flew through our process because that process was tuned. But what we realized was that customer, even though their volume was 10 pieces, that was production, and they wanted to see the parts on that order the same way they did 6, 8 months ago. And the expectation would be when they ordered it again in another 6 to 8 months that it had to be the same. And you can meet the print, but the part looks differently just in the way that you engineer it and run it through your shop. And so that's where we formally created a second production group where we did it the way that you're describing, is you had to do it that way so that they would have the consistency. And that's important. But on the flip side, when it's one and done, you can't spend any extra time on things that really don't matter, both because it costs you money, but also it slows down getting the parts out.
Yeah, you're 100%. It's funny because what you just described is basically the inverse of what we're looking at. And so I guess the question I have for you is this, because one of the things that we've considered is, because whenever you talk about it's a different production process, it's not necessarily like the part doesn't get cut on a laser and formed on a press brake.
Here's the mentality that we used. we wasted efficiency to save time.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And it's which one's more important given the
If you're only making 5 parts or 10 parts and you'll never see them again, it's the runtime really doesn't matter because it's all setup time
right.
and time in the office in your engineering group prepping the part to get out to the floor. So we wasted efficiency to save time.
Did you have different people that would focus on production versus the
Oh yeah.
rapid prototype stuff? Like, would the people never, like, if you were working on production, you would never touch this rapid prototype stuff and vice versa? Or did they flow
over time? Yes. That's why we had 2 separate buildings and the people different.
Right.
And
what about up front on the engineering and programming side? Was touched by the same people, or is that again 2 separate?
We never did it the way that you did it until we created those 2 separate buildings. We told the customer, I'm sorry, you don't like parts because they don't look exactly like they did last time. We can't make them consistent and be able to continue our business model.
Right.
We wouldn't cave to the customer's request.
Right.
And then finally it got big enough and the realization was it could be a strong, profitable business unit that we separated the 2. And here's the other thing that we did too is for anybody out there who's in the same position is I'm going to make up a number, but let's say the average part has a 5-year life cycle. What I realized is the first 12 to 18 months, you probably make 80 to 90% of the profit on the part, and then sustaining engineering on the OEM kicks in and they start squeezing you. So think of our prototyping and all that was maybe the first 3 to 6 months while the pilot runs, and then they started production, and that was the next from months 6 through 18. And we would come down a little bit on price from our prototypes. Like, we obviously they're buying more parts than but we wouldn't come down a lot. And then when they finally came back to us and started squeezing us, we'd say, thank you. We really appreciate the business and we understand why you have to move it elsewhere. And we didn't try to grow our production capabilities to be able to handle it through year 5. We signed off at month 18 and we're confident that our prototype business was going to continue bringing enough production business in that sort of cycle. And that allowed us to keep our profit margins really high.
No, it totally makes sense. How do you, I think it would be a lot harder to scale a rapid prototype type of business than it would be, the contract manufacturing one, only because, contract manufacturing, you can win a group of parts and it represents $1.2 million, right? It might last 5 years, but it's kind of like this nucleus of business that you can count on. And then you add another one and it kind of grows and grows and grows. And you might be able to do that with 10 solid customers versus rapid prototype. My assumption is that you're just constantly trying to find the next prototype or project work, right? Or do you have the same customers just feeding that stuff?
That my background was prototyping.
Mhm.
Yeah. I started out more on the plastic side and metal casting side. And what I saw and what gave me confidence is there's always prototyping work. And if you have a really strong sales and marketing organization, and there's some metrics you got to pay attention to, you grow to the prototyping demand that your sales and marketing creates. And for me, it was paramount. I was never going to sacrifice profit for revenue. We invested in sales and marketing, and that over time created a flywheel that had a really positive effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not one of those things you can go out and say, I want to do $1 million of prototyping this year. You might, or you might not. It depends because the customers have to find you at that moment when they need the prototype. And it blew my mind. We had pretty good name recognition. We had done work for engineers before and they would forget about us. And it blew my mind. It's like, oh, we did really good work for you before. How could you forget about us? And it reinforced that you just had to continually invest in sales and marketing to remind people. So when they had the project, you were there for us.
sales and marketing is something that, like passionate about, and probably like what I have got the biggest influence in on the business today. But back, I don't know, like when did Rapid start? Like what was the timeline?
September 14th, 2001.
So obviously there were some early years there where you didn't have tools like LinkedIn or social media or internet marketing, things like that. So how did you guys get your name out there in those days?
Well, Google AdWords were just starting, and we were one of the earlier job shop world users of Google AdWords. Those were huge. We also spent a lot of time and money on our website, so we got organic hits on the right words, and that was a lot easier back then. We promoted to the SolidWorks user groups, and I was really proud of how we supported them. I think it was a really good relationship where we helped them drive SolidWorks users to their user group meetings. And those were the type of people who in many cases were good customers for us. So we did that. We did promotions with customers for trying to referrals.
Yeah.
I was relentless. If somebody was copied on an email from an engineer, they got put in our database. So now I had another email address, and we would do email blasts all the time.
Yeah.
So it wasn't one thing, and it's still, I mean, some of the things work today that worked back then, and there's obviously new things like LinkedIn that are new ways to do it, but you can't just count on one way. I think if I was doing it, I would be creating a lot of content. I might even have my own podcast as a shop owner. I don't know what I'd talk about, but you want to create content, and the users will find you. It's sort of, you could spend a lot of money on marketing dollars, and I don't have any idea whether Facebook, Instagram, any of those work. They might, but you try different things, you double down on the stuff that works, and you grab every email address, every cell phone number you can. You got to be careful with cell phones and use them sparingly, but there's ways to market to cell phone numbers.
Did you guys ever have any like in-house salespeople, whether that be like a sales manager or reps?
Oh yeah. I had 20 salespeople at least when we sold the company. Had a VP of sales, 2 sales managers, and geographic territories. They all were pretty much based in New Hampshire, but then they would fly out to the territories. Oh yeah, we did tons of trade shows.
Yeah,
tons of trade shows. We did all the Design Depart, the TTP shows, and we didn't sit behind our table in the booth. We were out in the aisles and get people in. And if there's an engineer out there who walks the Design Depart shows in the 2010s, he knows what I'm talking about, because we would get over 100 leads every show, and booth next to us might have 10.
Yeah.
We were relentless.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good stuff. We brought on a sales position for the first time ever, probably about 3 or 4 months ago, because that really large in part, that's what kind of my role has been, because Everyday's never really had like any sales arm at all. Certainly didn't do any marketing. It was just kind of word of mouth and just organic opportunities that would pop up sparingly. But the revenue was pretty stagnant for quite a while, probably as a result of that. But I, as the owner, I would love to just spend all day just trying to find opportunities and doing all that, just because that's what I enjoy and feel like I'm good at doing. But you inherently get dragged into different things, whether it's intentional or not. And you all of a sudden, a week's gone by and you're like, Dad, I made one sales call. I reached out to one person. This is not sustainable if I really want to try to grow it. And so bringing someone on that they don't have to get distracted by all the other little things in the business that are going on, and they can really just focus on that. And so that's
here's something simple. Is in the early days, I would call every new customer myself, and I would ask them how we did, what we could do better. And, sometimes I got things out of that, but more it was that they were impressed that the owner of the company was calling them.
right.
And they were, probably a line engineer. That is an opportunity, I think, today, because most interactions take place digitally. So You hiring someone, having them on the phone, talking to people, having them visit.
Yeah.
If there's a local trade show, you absolutely should be at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm big on that stuff too. I'm always about if we can get a new lead to visit our facility, it's almost always a slam dunk because
Yeah. Yeah.
ours very, I feel like ours is very impressive. I've been to a lot of shops. There's a lot of good ones out there, but I just feel like we're up there with some of the best of them. And so when they see all the things that we're talking about, it really starts to click for them. And then the ball really gets to be put in our court and we can take advantage of the opportunity. But I love going out and visiting customers and having them with us.
Cody, what you just said, that should be a metric. That should be how you are incentivizing the salesperson you hired, and there's a bonus tied to it. Literally is, the number of visits by a prospect. Maybe you give like a half a point for a customer visit, somebody who's already a customer, but give a full point for a prospect.
Yeah, I like that.
And that's something I learned very quickly with my marketing guy, that he was very coin operated, and whatever I incentivized him for, he would do.
Yeah.
And I learned very quickly I had to think about what I wanted as the results, because I had to make sure the incentives would get me there.
Yeah.
So if you're saying that people coming in, it's a slam dunk, you get a business, sounds like you want to get a lot of folks in your shop.
Yeah. I'll definitely take note of that one. Yeah, it's definitely true. But even with that, I mean, just a lot of what I do to get new businesses is really using LinkedIn as a tool. I used it in a past life, and I agree with you. There's probably metrics out there that could probably prove this otherwise, but like the Facebooks and the Instagram and Twitter and all that stuff, at least in my experience in industrial manufacturing, don't yield as much of a result. Now, if you're trying to hire people and get, it's an HR related function, it's a different story, but LinkedIn's where it's at. And I've had a lot of success getting in front of customers that way and taking it to the next step with them. But so,
what do you specifically do on LinkedIn? What are your strategies?
It's pretty straightforward. You start to follow certain people, and really it's first of all defining either what type of industry you're trying to penetrate or market or whatever it may be. But once you've kind of established that, it's who are usually the decision makers within those organizations. And for us, that's typically a buyer, a director of procurement, sometimes an engineer, those types of people. You're not pinging the VP of operations of John Deere and saying, hey, can I sell stuff to you?
Yeah.
So you really got to narrow the focus to the people that are actually going to engage with you. And once you've done that, then it's really just a numbers game. It's how many of those points of contacts can you make and follow up with?
So when you say you follow them, do you follow them or do you connect with them? If you connect with them, do you write a really specific message that you have scripted already, or do you do it on the fly? Do you use the premium membership to send them the in messages? I want to get really granular.
So I do subscribe to the premium version, and I have our director of sales do it as well, but not so I can send them in mail. It's really to unlock more opportunities to send them connections, because what LinkedIn does is, if you're just an average LinkedIn user and all of a sudden you say, I want to go connect with 200 people that are in this particular industry or whatever on LinkedIn, it'll cap you after so many of those. So it'll say you've reached your quota or whatever for the week. And all of a sudden you can't do that anymore. But with premium, I don't know if it makes it unlimited, but it certainly makes it a lot more. So that's the main reason I pay, whatever it is, $75 a month to do that or whatever it is. But to answer your first question, so specifically what I would do is, so once I found somebody, I connect with them. I hardly ever send them like an in mail where they haven't already connected with me, because I get those a lot. And first of all, they go to a different inbox inside of your LinkedIn. And second of all, it's spam 90% of the time. So if they've connected with me back, then I try to make it happen as quick as possible. I don't care if I'm at home and it's 8 p.m. or if it's during work hours, but as soon as they, you get that notification that so-and-so has accepted your request, I always follow up with a message. And it is a scripted or boilerplate message that I kind of rinse repeat, but it's concise. It's to the point, kind of just stating like a call to action and what we're looking to do. But I just kind of replace the name of the business and the person, and I fire that off. And again, it's a numbers game. Sometimes you'll get a response back right away. Sometimes they'll want to do a Teams call, which is like jackpot. Like I got somebody on the hook. Sometimes they'll defer you to somebody else. But in the sales thing. I mean, you mentioned it. Emails and phone numbers are huge. So for me, I'm pretty good at investigating Google, is trying to hunt down people. But like, you know how it is. Like, you find the decision maker at a company, you know that at a minimum, you need to try to get them an email. But for a lot of OEMs, they don't just hand out their emails. So, you know, you kind of have to do some searching to figure out what's the email, like at so-and-so.com. And then B, what's the format? Is it first name, last name, at such and such? So once you kind of figure that out, then like the door really opens. You figure out who's who on LinkedIn, and you just type their email in and you can send them out emails.
I'll give you a hint. What we used to do is, like you said, there's these common ways that their names are formatted on emails.
Right.
We would send it out to all of them and figure out which, most of them bounce back. But
so for the ones I'm really, really interested in getting in front of, I've done that. Or like if the format's like, this is the one that I hate. I think John Deere's this way, but they've got last name, first name, middle initial. You really got to throw the middle initial in there. Like, I can find anyone's first and last name, but middle initial is her.
Yep. And is it a nickname or a real name? But
right.
Anyways, we used to have automated email tools, and we would just specifically send out something to get email addresses.
Right.
Have you ever tried, when you make a connection on LinkedIn, do you send a message with that, or do you not send a message, or have you tried both and it doesn't matter?
I've tried both, and I've never really had success with sending the message up front. Because to me, I mean, it's
okay.
You know what you're doing. You're asking them if you can make parts for them. You know that's what the ultimate bottom line of it is. But I don't want to come off as I'm trying to sell them a software or something like that, right? I want it to be like, hey, they've connected with me. Maybe they've had a few minutes to be like, oh, okay, these guys are, cheap metal fabricator.
Okay.
And then kind of let that settle and then hit them up.
So one thing that I have done, because you being the owner in your title, is I gave access of my LinkedIn to somebody.
Yeah.
Basically, they were able to use it because, as you said, your time is limited in that. So I let them use, in a sense, my name to make the connections.
Yeah.
And then I would say, oh, thank you for your interest. John is going to follow up with you and take then the next step. And that's really John doing that himself. But
I've actually done that too, to try to make the numbers game, try to put it more to our advantage. I've done the same thing. It's, in fact, that's why whenever I hired the sales position that we have today, this gentleman's been in the industry for 20 years. And, I'm not huge on titles. Like, I don't need to have a CEO title or anything like that. But whenever it comes to talking to people that you're trying to do business with, it does matter oftentimes. So there's a difference between saying, hey, I'm sales rep from Everyday Technologies, versus saying, hi, I'm the director of sales with Everyday Technologies. No different than to say, hey, I'm the owner of Everyday Technologies. So his title is director of sales for that reason, not because he started off as a junior sales rep and worked his way up, but just because that's what it takes sometimes to get the attention of people.
Let's pivot a little bit. Before we get done here, I want to understand a little bit about the journey you had in buying a shop, and let's pick some of the interesting stories, if you could, about that.
Yeah. Well, it was when I first engaged with the owners of Everyday Technologies, it was early 2020. I want to say it was like December of 19 to January of 2020. And at that time, it was get in front of them, sharing some emails, and ultimately them saying, hey, because they weren't looking to sell. It wasn't on the market, so to speak. But they were like, if you can basically provide proof of funds so that they knew that they could take it serious, they'd, I guess, sign in on a letter of intent. And so that's what we did. And probably, if I had to guess, it was like late February of 2020. And then, of course, in March, and I think at that time we had already just started the diligence process, like engaged with attorneys and accounting people and all that stuff. But then everything kind of went on hold because COVID. And so that probably went into hiatus for several months. And then, we kind of got back into things slowly. And then probably towards the end of 2020, started picking it back up more seriously. And then as we kind of got into 2021, we were kind of nearing the end of it. There was one outstanding item. It was a legal item on the current owner's side that they needed to see through. And I was like, listen, man, like, we've been going back and forth with this for what seems like forever, but certainly over 12 months. I've got a lot of time and money and honestly just passion into this whole thing, and I want to get it done. And they felt the same way, and felt that I was the, the right guy for the job at this point. And so what they agreed to do was actually bring me on as an employee in April of 2021, which was definitely unique. But we did that, and I kind of came on, and only a handful of people, not even a handful, probably 2 or 3 people actually knew that I was engaged to buy the business. Otherwise, everyone else didn't. But as you can imagine, I think I held that role for probably, let's see, April, May, June, July, August. Yeah, 4 months. And, I'm coming in there kind of in this like undercover boss mode, kind of a generic title. And, they played it all right. Like, this is Cody. This is why he's here. This is what he's going to be doing, blah, blah, blah. But my eyes are wide open because now I'm engaged in the business. And I went from seeing it on financials and all the stuff from a legal standpoint to actually living in it. And I'm asking questions and, trying not to be too obvious, but, well, why are you guys doing it like that and doing this? And they're just like, what's this guy? People started drawing their own conclusions. So by the time it was all said and done, I don't think it was a surprise to anybody, but so we officially closed in August. That was kind of the journey of buying the business. And it was challenging because it was about as straightforward as a deal as you could do, really. It was an asset sale. So it was really just a function of, fixed assets and net working capital. And it's kind of derived upon calculation of what that target working capital number is, where you're basically just buying, receivables, inventory, and taking on the responsibility of payables and things like that. So from that standpoint, it's fairly easy. We weren't buying it on a multiple of EBITDA and getting all these, different other avenues that you could go. But the owner himself had bought and sold businesses for years, and he tended to do it by himself. And I had engaged in an attorney that our family was familiar with, who was really, really good. And he'd get frustrated because he felt like the owner we were buying from was trying to do too much on his own. It was slowing the process down, blah, blah, blah. So there was times where you're just like, is this going to happen? And I was really passionate about it, and I was working a different job at the time. So that was unique to try to, stay focused on what I was doing to provide for my family and the responsibility I had to that company while being kind of married to this whole other process to buy another business.
How did you get the funds to buy the business? You said you're 100% owner.
Yeah. Without going into too much detail, basically I had a family member, my father-in-law, that had helped me acquire funds by basically providing collateral to back those funds up. So he, I wasn't given any sum of money or anything like that, but basically his role in the thing is my landlord. So he owns the buildings. And I was able to basically provide a financial arm for me to acquire the business. So my wife and I, we own the business. If this thing goes belly up, it's on us. And so, we definitely understand.
Is it bank financing then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So and obviously there's, if your viewers or, because obviously I was in that position really not that long ago of like, okay, I'm interested in buying a business, but how does one go about it? And businesses come in all different shapes and sizes and circumstances. So, you can get funding from a variety of different places. Obviously, family's one avenue, but seller financing is another one where the current ownership takes some skin in the game, depending on how motivated they are to sell it. Obviously, bank financing, depending on what your collateral position is. And just, there's a lot of different avenues. SBA loans. I would definitely recommend to any of your viewers that are looking out there to potentially acquire a business, there's more avenues than you think. So do the research.
And you mentioned it was an asset sale. So usually it comes down to an asset sale, but the value's created more on EBITDA. Are you saying then that you just bought the equipment and all that, and there was no consideration for EBITDA?
No, not at all. We purchased the assets, the fixed assets of the equipment at book value. And so if something was fully depreciated, it was $0. And then the working capital of the business. So it was a really good deal. The owners had bought and sold businesses for many years. So they're faith driven and they were really passionate about making sure that the business went in good hands, and they weren't as money motivated as maybe some other sellers might be for whatever reason.
It sounds like you found some really good folks to buy a business from. You said you've invested a ton too in the business in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we're directionally focused on how I'm asking this question, in that there's so many different ways you could spend money investing in the business. it sounds like those 4 months that you were there gave you a head start. What just sort of struck you as such a no-brainer, or it would be a detriment to the company that if I didn't make this investment? Well, let's start with those and see
Yeah.
where it goes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was some obvious ones. So coming into the business, and even the owners were transparent about some of these things, not 100%, but for the most part, coming into the business, obviously everyday technology has been around. Obviously they, if you go back to like 2005 through 2013, they were still investing in the business at that time and trying to grow it and all that stuff. And, they were responsible for probably taking it to 3 million to 9.5 million or something like that, which is not easy to do. So I do applaud them for doing that. But for the last probably 6 or 7 years of the business, they had not really invested in equipment. They were really just kind of riding the wave and let the current management team just kind of do their thing without major disruptions. And as a result of that, there was a lot of tired equipment in the facility. And then the organization itself was another one that stood out. I mean, equipment's obvious, right? I mean, you go through and say, damn, that laser's 20 years old. That's going to be a risk at some point if it's not already. And sure enough, it was. But so there's obvious things like that we addressed in the last couple of years. But then there's just things like the way the business is structured from like an organization, like a chart, if you will. So like what management exists and what silos and responsibilities there are and who's wearing what hat and are they wearing many hats. And we've addressed that several times over the last couple of years because that is such a tough piece of the equation trying to run a business, let alone grow one, to have the right people in the right seats working on the right things.
Sounds like you're using EOS if you're saying those words.
We're not, but it's actually an initiative of ours in 2025 to do the diligence to consider implementing it. And a lot of that's been, I made a connection with a gentleman that Lance from All Metals, and they of course have been using it the last few years, and he's really encouraged me to check it out and implement it. And so that's definitely been one of the biggest challenges in running a business is the people side of the equation, because you have all these great ideas, like we could go do this, this, and that, but you can't do that with one or two guys. I mean, if you're really trying to do that at scale, you got to have people and systems in place to be able to take on that work. And that's been a challenge for us for a variety of different reasons. So I know there's not a solution out there that says implement this and in 30 days, all those problems go away. But what I liked about EOS is it's at least got a framework of which you can run your business on that, if everybody's bought into it, can help you get to that next level. So we're definitely trying to address that in 2025.
Yeah, we use scaling up, which was the old Rockefeller habits, and we wouldn't have been able to do what we did without that framework and operating structure. And what really, I will say it did is it got out of my head what I wanted for the business. And I was talking to my executive team. However, we pushed it really all the way through the company, and everybody, what was going on is, so I'll say the biggest benefit was the communication and actually the bilateral communication, top down, but also bottom up, because we created a mechanism for the bottom up communication, which is super important. The communication was something that we would survey our team on a regular basis, and they always said they wanted more communication. And we communicate. I was like, I don't know what else to do. And we had monthly meetings where everybody on the shop floor, everything stopped. And I went through the previous month, and I did that myself. We're always posting stuff on boards and they wanted more communication. So what was hammered into me is you can never over communicate with your team. And if you're not communicating, then they're going to come up with their own answers, which may not align with what you want and what the company is actually doing. So,
yeah, that's actually a big part of. So, I mean, like ever since I've been in the business, it seems like I'd mentioned earlier on, like drinking from a fire hose. So you get in, there's a honeymoon period where you're like, we're going to do this, we're going to do that and do this. Yeah. And then you start to get in all these things and you start thinking like, oh my God, each one of these is a yearly project in and of itself. You're taking on 3 of them at once. And so we did that for a few years. And so I never really got a chance to really execute and do the thing that I said I was going to do, which was grow the business. It was always address some reasons why we can't. And so for the first time, I feel like we're actually in a position to say, we got to start taking advantage of all this stuff we've done. But then you step back and say, well, damn, even if you put a plan in place, whether that be a 1 year, 3 year, or 5 year strategic plan, do we even have a team in place that can pull that off? Because I'm sure you know this, as your business evolved from, Again, I don't know what were you guys doing at revenue when you said you sold?
We did just under 50 million.
So as you go from
And
1
I
million
would
to
say that
50
it was evenly divided between machining and sheet metal.
okay. So nonetheless, even if it was 20 million, there's an evolution of business that goes from 1 million and then 1 to 5,
Yeah.
4 to 10, right? So we're kind of in that weird crux right now where we're doing like $10 million, and to kind of get to that next level, you can't just have 1 or 2 people that answer every question in the business. You've got to be able to rely on people owning and respecting their discipline in the business. And I really want to make sure we get that right, or at least be on the right track this year so we can grow the way we want to do it.
My suggestion is your next hire somebody who's already done it at a $20 million level, whatever that role is. And you're going to have to pay them more money than you probably think you should. But if you don't do that, then they're learning on the job, and
Yeah.
that costs you time, which is, if you look at how much money you could make if you did it faster,
Yeah.
from the extra growth, it ends up being worth it.
I definitely can appreciate that advice, and I've heard it before, and I've done it. And what I've found in there is that you're 100% right, but there are times where just because someone's demanding a high salary doesn't mean anything. I've made that mistake in the last 3 years too, and you just got to do it and learn from it.
Yeah, I'm not saying you go out and find the people who want the most money. It's more, you're going to find the right person, and the appropriate compensation for them is going to be higher than is comfortable.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I couldn't have done at Rapid, directed what we did without the fellow Tom Persh, who came on as our COO when we were right about 5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And his background, he'd run 2 organizations, 2,000 plus people for a Fortune 500 company. So he had the organizational chops. He was phenomenal. He really was the one who put into place all the things that I wanted to do. He figured out how to make them happen. And in a sense, you create your own luck. I was looking for someone strong, and when the opportunity came to bring him on board, I jumped at it. And he was expensive.
Yeah.
But we had a plan, and that's the type of person I needed to be able to execute for us.
It wasn't tough for him to kind of go from one extreme to the next, like 2,000 people down here. 20.
Yeah, well, he was moving back to the New Hampshire area to be close to family again. So he was not shy of that. He thought this was only going to be a year job or so, and then he was going to find, the more appropriate job for him.
Right.
He ended up having so much fun and making such an impact, and he saw the opportunity, so he just kept with it. Yeah.
Did you own the business yourself, or was there other equity partners?
I had family and friend equity partners, and over time I bought some of them out. At the end, I think I owned, my wife and I owned 86, 88%.
Mm-hmm.
The rest was family and friends.
So outside of family, friends, did you ever have a situation come up in the tenure of running the business where equity stake was discussed as, for the example, that guy that you brought on, that COO? I mean, did he say, well, hey, I know you're at a smaller position, but phantom stock, whatever.
In essence, we created phantom stock. And so there were 4 people when I sold the company who had
golden parachute kind of thing.
They got a chunk of it.
Right.
So, but it wasn't formalized. They had the trust in me, and
you didn't have an employee agreement with them that stated that, if I sell, X and X happens.
No, and I wasn't even planning on selling.
Yeah.
So
I looked into that a little bit, as far as, I'm not as familiar as I probably should be, but who Rapid sold to and kind of that conglomerate of what that business is. I mean, I thought, what you guys did on the sheet metal side was very impressive at the scale of what you did it, but it turns out like this company that bought you guys had similar portfolio of companies that were doing it in plastics, whatever other industry they had, right?
Well, they started in injection molding and machining, and they had purchased a 3D printing company, and sheet metal really is the next commodity that you need to have. It's really hard to, as you know, to start a quick turn prototype sheet metal shop, particularly if you don't have a lot of skill set in the area, which theirs was somewhat limited in Minnesota. So the option was to buy us, or there really was no close second to Rapid Sheet Metal. They would have had to grow on their own, and then that would have just taken them too long. So the other is we created a really good economic case for some proprietary machining technology that we developed that we had patented. So if anybody's interested, they can go look up some of the patents that I did on that. And I don't know how much Proto Labs is using that or not today, but there's definitely, it was a pretty interesting way to dramatically increase machining revenue.
Wow. And did they approach you when you mentioned you didn't have the intention to sell? I mean, they came out of the woodwork and approached you?
We had created a joint venture where we were making parts for them and they were selling them under their name. As part of that, they had said that they didn't want to do it unless I would be willing to entertain an offer to sell. And the time was like, sure. What do I have to lose? I can always say, no, I don't want to sell.
Exactly.
So, and then they came back with essentially a silly offer, and yeah, it made sense.
Nice. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's anything that's on the table anytime soon for me, just being this early in it. But I've always found it fascinating. There's different types of owners. There's people that kind of come from the private equity world that are just about, buy the business, make the numbers look better, and sell it in 7 years or whatever it is, and drive value for the shareholders. And then there's like the guy who started it by himself, and it's just, it's like another child to him, and doesn't want to sell it, and becomes a generational business. And then there's the guy who maybe is like in my position, who, bought in young. And I find it fascinating because, there's like the PE side of things that are like when you have an owner or a stakeholder that's responsible for that particular business, they're very removed and very driven by like KPIs and financial things like that. And then you got the guy who's more passionate and knows the ins and outs of the business, is very ingrained into the details. But in any event, there's this like mentality that I've like read and learned and heard about that, as much as passionate as you are about your business, you never want your business to be hinged on your ability inside of it. Does that make sense? No, it's not that you necessarily say, hey, I need this thing to run on its own because I want to go put my feet up in Florida. But it's just that if the business is truly going to scale and do the things you want it to do, it can't be you doing everything, right?
I think another way of saying it, which is perhaps the correct way, I can't say that I did this, is, you want to run the business as if you'll own it forever.
Mm-hmm.
Have it prepared where you could sell it tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I definitely didn't have the business prepared from a buyer's perspective. So it made the process longer and a lot harder for Proto Labs to put their arms around us and come to terms with what we were doing. But I my original goal when I started, the first 2 years we did around $500,000 in sales. And I had always thought if we got to 5 million in sales, wow, mission accomplished. If you think about it, you create a $5 million business if you have 10% EBITDA or so, and I was a little naive about how much you have to invest back in the business, but that's 10% EBITDA after paying yourself. That's a nice lifestyle.
Yeah.
And so that was the goal and the aspiration. And then I sort of hit that. I realized I had blinders on. I was like, well, like customers wanted us to grow. There was a lot of demand. I was like, what else could we do? What's next? And I decided to let the customers, to have fun doing what we were doing, and then let the results of that hopefully delight the customers and let the customer demand increase how fast we grew a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what happened.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I'm sure there was successes, but many challenges along that journey.
Hell yeah. As any shop owner knows, it's not it's not a straight line.
I obviously have got a lot of friends in my age group, right? Being between 30 and 32. And it's not like they come up to me and say, wow, you're an owner of a company. Like, how cool. But like, everyone's just kind of like, well, what's that like? And blah, blah, blah. And it is funny because especially the younger generation just assumes that, okay, you're the owner or you're the head guy or whatever. Like life's great and life's easy. And it's like, I've never had more stress and more challenges daily than I've ever had than running a business. The only way I'm able to get through it is just because I genuinely am passionate and love what we do here. And so it balances it out. If I didn't, then it would just be a miserable life, but it's not an easy gig.
This was very deliberate. I don't know if it's obtainable or if it's an aspiration you would want to have or not, but I slept really well at night.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways I did that is I always had a month's cash in the bank.
Mm-hmm.
And I had obviously my receivables. And one of the beauties of the job shop work, the way we structured it, as opposed to contract manufacturing and what you described in the second half of 2024, is my largest customer ever was 3% of sales.
Right.
And we were growing at 20%, on average, 32% a year between 2010 and 2017. And after we got to a certain size, I'd say after that 5 million, I was able to sleep pretty comfortably at night and I wasn't that stressed. It was I'll say good stress, the result of growing the business. 2009 was stressful because the economy caved then and our sales went down, I think 26%. We were still profitable, but not where we wanted to be. But because we had the cash in the bank, because we had the diverse customer base, and we had the respect and the trust of the team that we were going to get through it, and just buckled up. And I honestly, for most of the time, slept really well at night, Cody.
Right.
It was because I put those things in place to protect the downside. I call it asymmetric risk. The upside's unlimited. I try to minimize the downside.
Right. No, that's really wise. And hope we get there.
Yeah, I tried to minimize my bank debt. I never used it, but I always had a line of credit available as much as the bank would give me.
Yeah.
And if I ever smelled that they were going to yank it, I probably would have taken it all. So there's all these things you can do. It's the thing that got hammered into my head. I was really blessed to have some, I called them the gray hairs, who mentored me, and they just hammered in my head, cash is king, cash is king. Right. And so that's what I was always looking at. It wasn't EBITDA, it wasn't, this and that. It was, do I have the cash to sustain if things just come crashing down?
Right.
And and we did.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yep, that's really good advice.
This has been fun. I'm sure we could have talked about a lot more. Anything else before we leave you want to throw out there to people? Any experiences, lessons learned?
I guess I would leave it with, if you ever do find yourself in a position coming into a company as an owner, and obviously it's a little different if you've worked your way through the ranks and have been there for 10 or 20 years, whatever, but don't get too far over your skis and really be a sponge and understand what makes the business tick. One of the things, I don't have any regrets. I mean, everything happens for a reason, but I would probably just take things a little bit slower. But that's probably a result of me being young, naive, and excited about all the opportunities that you just feel like I can take it all on. And I did, and we got through it, but would have probably done things a little bit differently in hindsight. So I would just say, come up with a strategy, understand its implications. Cash is king. You're 100% right. And have a little bit of patience, but never lose the edge to want to grow and do the things that you have set to do.
Love it. Love it. Anyone wants to reach out to you, what is the best way to do so?
I'll probably say start with LinkedIn. Connect with me and send me a message. And I'll be a part.
Not an email.
Right. Yeah, not an email. I ain't getting back to you.
Right. Well, loved it. This is so much fun. And maybe we could talk offline at some point. And if you're out in the Boston area, look me up, please. If you're listening, I hope you got as much out of this as I did, and thinking about the takeaway and something really to chew on. There's probably a couple. One of them is sales and marketing, and heard how Cody is doubled down on that. He's made a hire. He does it himself. And maybe, ask yourself, how much effort are you putting in daily, weekly on generating new business, if indeed generating new business is your goal? And the other is, do you sleep well at night? What is the stress that, if you're not sleeping well at night, keeps you up? And maybe it's not cash, maybe it's something else, but this should be fun. So I would encourage you to try and figure out how to sleep well at night. Until next time, keep those lasers cutting and those spindles turning. Have a super day.
Thanks for listening to the Job Shop Show podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe so future episodes are automatically downloaded directly to your device. You can also leave an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Not only do I read every single one, it also helps me understand what content matters most to you. Thanks again for listening to the Job Shop Show.